my PC gamer
That's
reaction was?
Oh yeah.
Oh, it wasn't mine.
It got you
Because-
were playing adventure games, not RPGs, so you didn't
that's
have
true. That's true.
preconceptions about what an RPG should be.
Right.
The Japanese RPG is a very different creature than the American RPG, and Dragon Quest is exactly why that's the case.
Well, one thing that I was just curious about was Dragon Quest ever distributed or disseminated by computer? Was it ever?
It was on the MSX. The original
Yeah.
Dragon Quest came out on the MSX home computer / console hybrid in Japan. But aside from that, I think maybe Dragon Quest 2 also.
Dragon Quest 2 did, yep.
And that
but
was
then it stopped.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other than that, it's been entirely a console system or series.
All right.
What essentially, what's kind of funny is that I think NX, NX America made the big play to try to get RPGs going in the U.S. By releasing themselves after Dragon Warrior 1 came out, Dragon Warrior 2, 3, and 4 for the NES. And this was in an era where, Final Fantasy 2 and 3 got passed over. But then as we went to the Super NES era, it was Square that started making the moves with Final Fantasy on the SNES, whereas Enix dropped the Dragon Quest series altogether.
I think that Enix intended to bring over, my understanding is they intended to bring over Dragon Quest 5 and 6.
Yeah.
But the RPGs they released before that were really, really crappy, like RoboTrek and Brainlord. And no one bought them, and so they had to close up shop in the U.S. And they didn't actually return to the U.S. until, Dragon Quest... Well, no, I guess it was Valkyrie Profile might have been the first thing they published.
Yeah, could be.
So yeah, they were gone for about 5 or 6 years.
Right. I mean, but basically, what ended up happening was that when the RPG genre, and of course, there's back and forth here. Like Final Fantasy helped that genre get bigger in the U.S., but also, Square was really helped by the fact that it was during the Super Nintendo era that the genre really took hold. And so their efforts, at least in the U.S., were significantly better than what Enix was doing.
Right.
RoboTrek, I played that.
Well, I think they both had big ambitions in the U.S. It's just that Square's worked out better until they released Secret of Evermore, and then it all kind of went down the toilet.
Yeah, right. Then they shut them right down.
Right. Yeah. But no, I think one of the big reasons that Final Fantasy VII was big over here and Dragon Warrior 7 wasn't was graphics. I mean, Americans. They didn't in the PlayStation era. Well, no, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say that Dragon Quest 7 was really big in Japan because it played so much like the Famicom games, and by that point, you had adults who had grown up playing the early Dragon Quests, and so they had that sense of nostalgia. They were like, "Oh yes, this is what I grew up with. It's so familiar and comfortable." I remember, childhood months sitting around playing Dragon Quest 3 or whatever, but most Americans didn't have that because the game was so niche-y over here. Whereas Final Fantasy VII was a very different and fresh experience at the time. It was very flashy and arguably had quite a bit less depth than Dragon Warrior 7. But it, it didn't have to subsist entirely on nostalgia. It could just, be flashy and awesome looking and
Enix didn't have any
battling.
FMV cutscenes to.
I think there was some FMV in Dragon Warrior 7, but it was really bad.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
it was 16-bit era bad. Dragon Quest, big in Japan.
Well, I mean, it goes beyond just being a video game in Japan. It is just it's in a class of all in its own. Like, people who know nothing about video games know what Dragon Quest is and have played it.
I think, yeah. No,
its creators are national celebrities. Like, people might not know who Miyamoto is in Japan, but they know who Yuji Horii is.
Right.
This guy.
And of course, it helped that they dragged in people to work on the series who were already celebrities. Akira Toriyama was already famous at that point. And that was one of the big things that actually sold the series was they were like, oh, it's the guy who did Dr. Slump. I love Dr. Slump.
Yep.
So let's play Dragon Quest.
What is
because
that?
Dr. Slump.
What is that?
It's a manga that
You don't know
Toriyama,
Dr. Slump?
Oh my God!
Stop, you guys! Stop it!
Yeah, what is Dr.
I'm
Slump?
asking for our listeners, you guys.
Dr. Slump is the manga that Akira Toriyama did before Dragon Ball.
Oh, yeah. It was
Okay.
relatively
Apparently,
popular.
I've heard it's the only good thing he's ever done in his life.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh.
And the original, the first
and the Chrono Trigger
the first
designs.
couple of years of Dragon Ball were supposally actually good.
Okay. Well,
But anyway, yeah, and
I'll take someone else's word
Sugiyama,
on
who did
that.
the music, was a well-known composer in Japan at that time
Koichi
too.
Sugiyama.
Oh, so he was
a
well known
famous
before.
Oh yeah,
composer.
yeah.
I didn't know
for
that.
television and film music competition. Yeah,
Yeah, it's actually it's always been kind of amazing to me that they managed to get him to do Famicom music because it was so limited at that point. I mean, that was 1986, and no one really knew how to maximize
Do you know
the hardware.
the story behind this?
No, tell us.
As I heard, he played an Enix game, I forget which one, before Dragon Quest, and he filled out the comment card that came with the game to be like, yes, I like this. On a scale of 1 to 3, this game was a 4, whatever. And they saw the name, and they wrote back to him, and they're like, are you the Koichi Sugiyama? He's like, sure. And they're like, you want to do some music for our next video game? Yeah.
God, I hope somewhere at Enix they have that, like, framed comic.
Yeah.
This game was fun. I liked it.
Check your career. Famous composer. It's between firefighter.
There's a famous urban legend, which is an urban legend, is not true, that Dragon Quest games are not allowed to be sold on school days. That there's like the Japanese Diet passed a law that prevented that, which is actually the case. But there was quite a bit of protest because kids were skipping school to line up and buy copies of Dragon Quest 3 at back in the NES days, and that caused some concern. So I believe the actual story is that Enix voluntarily said, we'll start selling these on weekends because we don't want to be a disruptive influence on the lives of Japan's youth.
It was probably some town council or something that whatever. This is David Sheff's fault again, the guy who wrote Game Over, which is filled with inaccuracies and bullshit. So.
Oh,
okay.
David Kohler is calling you out. Come to Retronauts and fight for us.
I'll go Uwe Boll on your ass.
But so, so when does Dragon Quest 9 come out in Japan then?
I believe it's sometime next year, actually.
Before the end of the year.
I think the game is pretty far in development, and development for Nintendo DS is nowhere near as complex as development for PlayStation 2.
Right.
So I think
that's the thing about it. They're going to make a ton of money on this thing.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
And it's also a testament to, I think, the way things are going to be going in the future. People will look at the development costs and overhead for Xbox 360 from PlayStation 3 and say, that's just not worth it. We can make so much more money if we go with something that has more modest hardware specs like the DS or maybe the Wii or even the PSP. Although that probably won't happen so much in Japan.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be... I think you're going to see a lot more stuff happening on DS, but that's a topic for the next section of our podcast. So let's take a break and we can talk about it some more then. And it's time for the weekly virtual selection section, the elimination match where we decide what games we want to see on Virtual Console, Xbox Live Arcade, or the PSP download service. It's not really an elimination round, so you don't have to look so panicked, Chris. We're not going to kick you out. But yeah, basically we just talk about a game we'd like to see. We'd be willing to pay money for these. Publishers, pay attention. We're offering you fat loot. So listen. I'm going to keep with the theme today and say I'd like to see Dragon Quest IV because it's the hardest and most expensive, hardest to find and most expensive of the Dragon Warrior games. It came out on the NES in 1991, 92, so it was kind of at the end of the life cycle. It was a big, complex game. It was very expensive at the time. And it was remade for PlayStation in Japan, but never made it over here because of weird
I remember that.
factors,
I remember Square was initially interested in bringing it over, but
they were interested, but apparently the development team who ported it,
they went out
had
of
to
business
move on. No, they had to move on to something, or they
really?
Yeah, they went out of business. Maybe
I think that's what it was. They went out of business, and then Square was trying to see if they could still work on it a little bit or not,
but. The idea was that they needed the original developers of the remake to port it over themselves. So it never made it here, which means that if you want a copy of Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior 4 now, you're going to have to pay buku bucks on eBay. It's at least $60 without anything, like just the bare game. And if you get it with manual box, it's 100, 150, 200. So yeah, I'd be willing to pay $5 for that, definitely. So let's see some Virtual Consoling. Nintendo, Enix, Square Enix. Yes, Jen.
Hi. How's
What's
it
your
going?
selection for virtual selection?
Well, let's talk Super Nintendo games.
Okay.
Yes, let's.
The best. The best console
Better not say
ever
Donkey Kong Country.
made. Oh, that would actually. But what I'm actually focusing on are games that I cannot run in emulators well. What cannot?
What are those?
What cannot be emulated well that I actually would want to pay for?
I'm going to guess.
Oh, like
Yoshi
any of the
Safari.
Yeah.
What?
Yoshi Safari.
Yeah, or the 6-game collection that
Super
came
Scope
with
6.
Super Scope 6.
Oh yeah, that's what you want.
That's what you want.
I was thinking something more in the way of like Super Metroid or Star Fox. Something.
Pick one and go with it.
Super Metroid, the greatest classic of all.
I'm sure your
time.
wish will be granted in due time.
And it better be, because that is a game that at this juncture is only it cannot be emulated properly as far as I'm concerned.
Really?
Yeah, well, and my computer is kind of a hunk of junk. I think emulators just kind of break around its greatness.
Does it intimidate them?
I think
Is
so.
that the problem?
Yeah, they slow way the age down. It's just it's impossible for the game to retain its original pacing when
And
it's
majesty.
like, oh my god, lag. And on a Super Nintendo game. And also, unless you have enough money to grab yourself a Super Nintendo expressly for the purpose of playing this excellent game. If you
Which is
don't
worth
already
it.
have one,
It's worth
it
it.
is worth
Yeah,
it.
that's
worth
a,
it.
And
it's one of my favorite. It's got to be
Oh, yeah.